Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you have your coffee, your tea. We're here with the Reverend David to continue our conversation. Not quite a smooth segue. That's okay. So we've been having this wonderful conversation over the previous 7 episodes, What is Truth? And I think that that's like this deep, deep well of content. And that's why I picked it. I thought, well, you can't run out of subject matter. And so I think that that's where it is. But when you consider it in light of what we're trying to do here, you always have to consider the Western tradition in light of the concepts of the good, the true, and the beautiful, as so eloquently expressed by Plotinus and all of his attendant Neoplatonic authors, as they're so labeled by academicians. The dean in England, William Ralph Inge, did a nice 2-volume set on Plotinus that I looked through my assortment of books and realized that I had let it go some time ago, which is unfortunate. But I can always return. Anyways, I'm getting off into obscurities, as is my wont to do. But I thought that today we could kind of get into bringing us to a deeper understanding of what is the nature of truth as we meet it as human beings within the physical world, in the face of the supersensible worlds. And that is something that kind of gets set by the wayside, even by people that like to think that they represent that type of thought. Their approach is kind of formed from that materialistic thought cast of the 19th century into the 20th century. So consequently, we're stuck. And yes, I said consequently again. Consequently, we're stuck in trying to understand a subject without the necessary language skills to be able to accommodate those types of thought. And as many of you already know, my background, although it's amongst many traditions, my central approach is the work of Rudolf Steiner in anthroposophy, which is also known as spiritual science. And in there, you're given the necessary concepts with which to try and tackle the challenges of being within, crucified on the cross of space and time. And that's where we are here in our fourth world, as the Hopi like to call it, as it's called in the fourth tradition, with the mystery of birth and death, the fourth mystery. And so consequently, we're dwelling in this realm, and to the extent that we can create a context for understanding and living with the actual presence of the supersensible, with your guide being Yeshua or Jesus Christ. That's what we're doing here. If you're not good with that, that's fine. There's plenty of other things you can do. You can go play war games. But in my books, the Arcana of the Grail Angel, Spiritual Science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, and also my second book, The Arcana of Light on the Path, I attempt to develop the canon of numbers as expressed within the work of spiritual science, which grew out of the Rosicrucian impulse, which in turn grew out of the Knights Templar impulse, which in turn grew out of the Grail impulse in the 9th century. And it was Walter Johannes Stein who did the great work, World History in Light of the Holy Grail, the 9th century. And it's key in that during the time of Charlemagne, of which it was, the 8th and 9th century, the early period of the Holy Roman Empire, as it was so called. Of course, one has to remember that the Pope, unbeknownst to Charlemagne, dropped a crown on his head and crowned him emperor, so thereby making that position beneath the papacy, which Charlemagne had no idea he was doing it. He snuck up on him and did it, which is a pretty interesting episode in history, really. It's like, tag, you're it. It's like, we got you now. But in any event, in the Eighth Ecumenical Council of 869 AD, they made the pronouncement that became an official position of the church that man was a being of body and soul, and that he could have certain spiritual qualities expressed in his being, but that it was heresy to say that man had a spirit. And so that's when they dropped the ball, really, as far as being able to come to understanding of what it means to be a threefold human being. And that's to a large extent what Rudolf Steiner's spiritual science is attempting to correct. And it was Walter Johannes Stein, who was one of the key young people that was around him, he was actually a physicist. But in the first Waldorf school, Rudolf Steiner told him he should be the history teacher, which is interesting because that wasn't his background. And Rudolf Steiner would tend to do that. He would tend to give you a task that wasn't your specialty so that it would be developmental for you too. And that there's a certain wisdom in that that's really quite special. So consequently, as we get into understanding what this might mean, spirit, soul, and body, which is really the true expression of how man is to be understood within the works of St. Paul. And therefore, it's the obvious choice, but then the church didn't want you reading the Bible. They were going to tell you what it was supposed to mean anyway. So it's only in recent memory that the church has really allowed its parishioners to consult the Bible on their own. Because if you take it on your own, then that's a straight path to heresy, because might come up with an opinion that differed from the mother church. And so that's caused countless lives over the course of history, and especially in England, as they seemed to wobble back and forth between Catholicism and what became Anglican back. And every time that they'd wobble, they'd make a pronouncement that anybody who didn't go along with the program was sentenced to death or to be drawn and quartered or something charming like that. So consequently, there's this like real rugged history that follows, that's based on any philosophical persuasion you might have up until modern time, where now warfares, although they kind of disguise themselves as being ideological, like the 20th century was the century of ideology. You know, what ism do you adhere to? And once you get to see through the veneer of that, it boils down to understanding the world as a question of balance between that the solvia coagula, the dissolving process, and the crystallizing process. Dissolve, crystallize, and these two forms, the dissolving being Lucifer and crystallization being Ahriman. So that's the materiality of Ahriman and the immateriality of Lucifer. And so we're kind of stuck between these two extremes, and people tend to misunderstand that and think that Lucifer is just the first name of Satan. It's like, no, they're two different things. And but this hadn't been made clear until the work of Rudolf Steiner, really, although there are intimations of it elsewhere. For example, in the music of Franz Liszt. I'll leave you with that riddle that a friend of mine solved for another episode. But in any event, it's just a greatest pleasure for me to introduce once again Reverend David William Parry, the author of Mount Athos Inside Me. I always got so many books around me that I can't seem to find things. Mount Athos Inside Me, and Caliban's Redemption, a poetical work, and his The Grammar of Witchcraft, which, no, it's not a book on witchcraft. It's a Shakespearean study. And so, David, how are you? Reverend David, excuse me. I forgot your honorific.
Oh, David is fine. David is fine. The priest named me David. I've been very, very proud to sport that ever since. Always wonderful to see you, John. Of course, today I'm sporting my new prescription glasses. I got two yesterday, one for farsightedness, and these wonderful glasses that make me look reminiscent of Carl Jung, which is why I chose the frames. For short sight, but of course it's for text really, as opposed to sort of YouTube chat. So I'm getting used to it. Oh God, you say so many wonderful things. I remember when I started reading the existentialists. It started curiously before I went to uni. It started with Jean-Paul Sartre. I mean, I actually didn't read my beloved Kierkegaard until I got to university, and it was actually some of the plays of Sartre I'd read, not his monstrosity, being a nothingness. He sent a copy to the philosopher Heidegger, who wrote Being and Time. Am I allowed to use a profanity? I do apologize to all our listeners. When Heidegger received a copy, he called it by that wonderful German word Dreck, which of course can be interpreted as muck or something much more horrible. So, which was a bit harsh. I mean, and then Heidegger said something else that it was what a French Cartesian made of something like German thinking, which was a bit snooty, and not entirely kind. So I remember reading about this wonderful short, pug ugly Frenchman running along the streets shouting existence before essence, and then writing these incredibly obscure plays. Although I did see in camera live once, I mean, how secular are secular people? I mean, when he was writing about Jean Genet, who should have won the Nobel Prize for Literature but didn't, and there's a show in itself, because he was LGBTQ, so in those days it was considered a persona non grata, so don't do that. But Sartre called it Saint Genet, so you're looking at Saint Genet. And a lot of his work is Sartre's work is to do with religion or the afterlife. I mean, people tend to forget in camera it's actually set in the afterlife, it's not set here. Where, what that famous phrase, hell is other people, which comes from that play, which again, maybe yes and maybe no. I mean, you get out more, have a nice glass of wine, chill, don't be so critical. I think the existentialists, as I think I said before, are very good at analyses, but they're not too good at solutions. But they are good at analyses, which is why they're worth looking at. You mentioned spirit and you mentioned young people. I think they came up last week. I'm not against young people. Some of my best friends are young people. I'm against the gender prescribing culture that's slowly arising around us, where certain powers that be seem to be determined to encourage a generation war. Don't these people have families and grandparents and great grandparents? That worries me no end. I mean, it seems to be taking much greater root in Latin America, I'm told, than in Europe. Although certainly there are those trends in Europe now. You know, why don't old people just stay at home? Why don't older people just mind their own business and let younger people get on with reality? Which always reminds me of something like, you know, the Japanese painter Hokusai. You know, what was it? He didn't really, he felt he hadn't done anything of worth until he was 40, and it looked up from there. You know, I think we got to be a bit careful, because the spirit can work its miracles at any age in life and any time in life. It doesn't need a genetic agenda. It doesn't need a genetic clock. I think Steiner is incredibly astute on all of those matters. And for me, I suppose, since we're launching into another exploration of truth, for me, it was ironically existentialism in the guise of Gabriel Marcel, who was, of course, was also a playwright as well as a philosophical writer, that made me realize you could have Christian existentialism. Indeed, Sartre was asked, you know, because Marcel is a friend of yours, do you think there's such a thing as Christian existentialism? And to be fair to the man, he did actually say yes. I mean, it wasn't really his thing, but he did say yes, it was. So, you know, the spirit is there, but I rather like the idea of an emergent spirit. I rather like that. You know, for one of the sub themes, one of the subgenres in Christian tradition for me, and I agree with you utterly. You know, we're in the West. We need to look at what the West is saying about these things, because I really don't believe that other cultures and other civilizations have said more than ours. And that's not to say there's no depth in Buddhism or Hinduism. I think there's absolutely staggering depth in both. But you know, without knowing the Pali Canon backwards and without knowing Sanskrit like you're a native, you know, how far are you actually going to get with all of those things, unless you want to live in India and take 10 years to acclimatize and then start your spiritual journey after that, you know, because it's not an easy process. So yeah, for me, it's all about emergent spirit. You know, I think it's not so much a case of existence before essence as the naive and the unformed and the untrammeled and the early stages of crystallization without the influence of the Christ energy, which we need. Um, I'm grateful. I think the Bible Belt detest me. I hope they don't. Bible Belt, invite me for a chat to America. I would love a chat with you all. Um, I think they hate me, that said. You know, you were saying about the sort of Rosicrucian impulse, the esoteric impulse, all of which is rich and there. And somebody asked me during the week, why do you keep going on about symbolism? To be honest with you, John, I didn't realize I did. I mean, obviously you've got to stop me with this endless tirade about symbolism, which I never talk about. You know, I never stop talking about at all. I didn't realize I did. And yes, there is a lot of symbolism in European culture and European arts, but why not? Those are doors and windows to the unknown as well. I think Steiner, the more I consider his legacy, did absolutely astonishing and exemplary work. You know, but it wasn't my primary way, which is why I think these discussions with you are so enlightening, not only for me personally, but I hope engaging for our viewers. You're looking at someone versed in that current and somebody astonished by that current, somebody that wants to know its richness and its depth and has found it nothing but fulfilling in the little I do know about it. For me, I suppose the art form that grabbed my attention most, as people in this country know, is theatre. And, you know, therefore, for me, I suppose staging these truths is just as important, which Steiner was interested in, of course. Staging these things, even though we live in a primarily literate culture, you know, until recently, I think it was a culture based around literacy. Now it seems to be a culture based around the image and the pictorial. And that for me is quite dangerous, because that can, you know, you can imagine that going in a number of directions. But no, we need to. For me, it's a question of how do we approach truth? How do we approach the goodness and the beautiful and the true through the arts? And in my case, through through poetry and theatre, and what do we do then? Certainly, you've got me thinking, how do I learn from Steiner a bit more, and where do I take it from there? What a rambly opening from me. What do you think, John?
I sometimes lose control of my cursor, especially when I start laughing. And I think the point of this, what we're doing here, is it's something that's covered within the fairy tale of Goethe's, The Green Snake and the Beautiful Lily, where the four kings are enthroned in the subterranean mystery temple, and they're roused before to presage a new age of man, when the serpent, who became luminous by consuming the gold, and she'd swallowed it, and so she radiates light into this dark sanctuary, and the dialogue takes place between the Golden King and the green snake that has become radiant. And the king says, whence come you? And the serpent replies, out of the clefts where the gold dwells. What is more glorious than gold? Light. What is more quickening than light? Conversation. And that kind of sums it up for me, is that still screwing around with this computer stuff here. There we go. So that consequently, this is why we're here. And conversation is something that can be truly, truly uplifting. It can have other results, but I think that what we're trying to do here is kind of build something that can be inhabited in the realm of thought. I know it helps carry me through the week. I find this very enlivening to be able to participate in these conversations and share with our narrow following. But it will come and go. And I'm reminded of something that Rudolf Steiner had said about that we have to remember, when you plant seeds and you're expecting plants to grow, that most of them are not going to sprout, but the few that do, that's the value of your effort right there. And so it is with things like this. I'm sure that there, more than a few people have walked away and said, these guys are nuts. And that's good. This is not for them, and that's fine. They can go do whatever it is they do. But consequently, we're going to move on forward here and get into the exploration of truth, of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And one of the most important figures in the tradition of what we're referring here, the good, the true, and the beautiful, it was the Marcus Vitruvius Polio. And he was like the guy in terms of architecture. And in the 1st century BC, he wrote his multi-volume work, De Architectura. And his work became the standard of proportion in architecture, and the basis of architecture being the proportions found in the human body. And so you see the Vitruvian man, that famous drawing with his arms extended within the circle and the square of Leonardo da Vinci, even though he chose to express a different version of the canon of proportions from Vitruvius, which has led to volumes of commentary as to what that might mean. But nonetheless, the important thing to keep in mind is that the temple is man. Man meaning man, woman, not a gender. So there's no gender implied. Man is Indo-Aryan language group root that makes reference to the thinking principle. Manas is the Sanskrit root. And so the manas is something that's at play here. That we're dealing with that realm, the architecture of thought. And consequently, in understanding the architecture of thought, it's helpful if you go beyond just the arithmetic involved, but you get into the geometry. And at the School of Plato, it was like required that you knew geometry to even walk through into the courtyard, right? And the famous quote is, God geometrizes. And I think if you want to even get into the realm of physics, a lot of the problematic aspects of modern science are due to the arithmetical side of the equation, and that geometry is far more representational of our perception of reality, even within material science, because it has to do with form. And so it's through form that beauty arises, yes? So you have the good, the true, and the beautiful. And so the good is to be able to truly perceive the beautiful. I mean, that's ultimately what it is. And I guess you could say that the summation of all three is love, right? As Buckminster Fuller, the great geometer, said that love is the glue of the universe. That's quite a thought. And it was kind of great. On Twitter one time, I made reference to our Buckminster Fuller, and his granddaughter responded to me on Twitter, who I didn't even know she was on Twitter, and she acknowledged my acknowledgement of the importance of his work. And there's some other concepts within Buckminster Fuller that could be very, very helpful. But he was somebody who was extremely a creative genius, and he was able to even create new geometrical forms that hadn't been done before him. I mean, that's pretty good, you know. You'd have thought Euclid would have done that, but such is not the case. So before I digress too far, we have to get into understanding, okay, so you have the first temple and you have the second temple. The second temple is burned, and now there's the waiting for the third temple. And the third temple actually can be seen as man, the highest expression of man being Jesus Christ. And he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I will rise again, right? And so consequently, that is the root of the actual tradition of the cathedrals, the Templars, and the true lodges of the West. And because I see a lot of narrative out there that really gets off in some pretty far out directions, trying to interpret the place of the Templars and trying to attribute to them all kinds of nefarious things that are based upon the tortures and trials by Philip le Bel at the demise of the Templar order. But to understand the mission of the Templars, you have to keep in mind that they existed and prospered in the same period of time as the Gothic cathedrals, and that when the Templars went into their demise, the Gothic period ended. And so that to me kind of clearly points out their relationship to the administration and the funding and the building of the great cathedrals all over Europe that you could say are embodiments of that concept, the temple is man, because you see that the general architecture of cathedrals is cruciform. It's a cross, and like Plato said, we're crucified on the world's soul is crucified, right? That's what's happening here. That we're at this juncture of time and space, and when you get into like some of the philosophical deliberations that you're making reference to, that's basically what they're trying to talk out is what is this thing we're in here having to do with space and time. And it's interesting because the temple tradition like has embodied within the Templar stream and in Freemasonry, you see that the whole idea of the grand architect of the universe. That's the G inside of the square and compass. And so that there's that whole idea of the architect of the world. And there's famous drawings of Christ holding a compass, and he's circumscribing the globe of Earth, right? And so so in light of this, what we're looking at is that the form of your cathedrals, where they have the horizontal and the perpendicular expressed in the architecture, the Gothic architecture, that is that whole mystery as represented. And so what does form represent within the Christian tradition? And you look toward the understanding of the school of Dionysius the Areopagite in the Nine Hierarchy, is that the spirits of form, the exousiai, the Elohim as they're called in Hebrew, they exist at the juncture of space and time. And so if you go beyond them to the higher spirits of the dunamis, kuriotes, and the thrones, cherubim, seraphim, that those are beings that live in the eternal realm. They're beyond space and time, but so that consequently the Elohim can work within this world, unlike the other beings. Although they do work in this world, it's just so transcendental that we're not at this stage of the game very capable of being able to even conceive of what that might mean. It's what Rudolf Steiner or the Rosicrucians would call the world of duration, and that's that eternal, the macroprosophos, the great face of God. And so consequently, as we look at the Ark of the Covenant that was given to the Israelites, and that was their covenant, that if they followed the proportions as expressed by Yahweh, the temple structure and all of that was according to certain rules of architecture that made the indwelling of Jehovah Elohim a reality, and that it was such a sacred reality that they could just go very specially go in once a year and pronounce the sacred name. And so there's this tremendous reverence. It's like that Goethe makes reference to. He says, people run around, I'm just paraphrasing because I don't feel like looking it up. People run around every day saying the good God, the great God, and all this. He says, if they had any idea how profound that is, that they would, just be so humbled to hardly ever say the word. And I think that that's the kind of the mood of soul that a person in the modern world has become so secular, so prosaic, so earthly, that they maybe can't even conceive of that mood of soul. And it's that mood of soul that preparing for a guest, that is like the bride and the bridegroom, the sacred marriage, the chemical wedding, that is that's the ultimate allegory. And of course, this is something that can take place in the gold, light, and conversation.
Gosh, you reminded me of something there. Many years ago, I went to the music festival of Oberammergau. My favorite country in the world, apart from the one I might be moving to, but that's a different conversation, is actually Austria, because it's so. Not only is it so bloody civilized, you Austrians, it's also beautiful beyond belief. So I hate you, Austria. I hope you're listening. I hate you, Austria. Okay, it's just so breathtakingly lovely. And I hope they haven't. There was talk back in those days they were going to change the rules. I mean, when I went, they were still only performing the Passion Mystery every 10 years. It comes from a legend that the plague was raging through Europe, and they're at the very top of the mountains. The burghers, the elders, went to pray to ask that the plague didn't visit them, and if they were saved, if they were spared, then they'd enact the Passion every 10 years. And they were spared, and they kept their promise. It turned into this sort of spectacular opera, that actually opera in the classic sense. I was going to say, for want of a better word, but that's the classic sense of opera. And I remember being invited. It's only 2 streets. Oberammergau back in those days was 2 streets at the top of a mountain. And there was a gigantic musical auditorium at the top. You have to get there because it takes over the whole village for about 2 weeks, for a season, which lasts about 2 weeks. And we had to be wrapped like centipedes or caterpillars in blankets to survive the cold as we watched the vapors rising off of the mountains, off of the Alps, to listen to this gorgeous music and watch the Passion enacted in front of us. The saying, the way you greet someone in Oberammergau is you say "Grüß Gott," great God. You don't say hello. You don't say good morning. You say "Grüß Gott," and I've never forgotten that. And it's only in that area. If you say it to another Austrian, they look you in the face because they don't know what you've just said to them. It's the magic of wording, John. The magic of wording is ultimately linked to spirit. I'm absolutely certain of it. And yes, the greatness of God is something that's sadly obscured nowadays. I don't really know why. Which leads me, because any look at nature, let alone the glory of the medieval cathedrals, will show us the splendor of nature, the magnificence of beauty impregnating the world around us. The world is a beautiful place. I've got a confession to make on that note. I think our rising and falling following will actually grow because we're having a good old chinwag, and I think people like that, and also the fact you can be thoughtful and have a chinwag. I think that the fact that comes as news to people nowadays is shocking, but you can, and we're doing it. So I'm very optimistic about this show and our project, our enterprise. I think it's going great guns. You need people of all sorts. I mean, you touched upon it yourself, which leads to my confession. I'm actually an honorary member of the Cambridge Atheists. I'm not quite sure how that happened. It all seems to be, because I know Ray Tallis. I know Richard Dawkins. Ray Tallis is a friend of mine, an extraordinary individual. I mean, in one of the theatre companies I created a couple of years back, we actually launched one of Ray's books in a Russian book centre, believe it or not, a Russian bookshop. And everyone had a great time. I think that connection came around because I was so rude about Billy Graham's last visit to the UK. I was rude. I'm sorry. I take it back. I was rude. No, I don't take all of it back. I take some of it back. Yes, I was rude. I admit it. And that seems to be where I was kidnapped and shanghaied into the realms of Cambridge atheism. They needed to check their facts a bit more because, yes, I was a pastor. but they haven't rescinded that very kind invitation, and I've never said I don't want to be associated with you. So there we are. And it gave me the chance to meet people I'd never have met otherwise. But again, it's me accentuating the positive, John. I've learned some great things from them too. I've learned the sheerly overpowering magnificence of nature. Was I aware of it beforehand? Of course I was. But to have people study these things, the miracles of the microworlds, genetic structures, subatomic structures, and the genuine glory that takes place at those levels, it leads me to a sense of wonder. I mean, that's Schopenhauer, isn't it? A man educated by wonderment. And I think Ray Tellis, if you ever watch this, Ray, don't jump on me. I think you're educated by that too. And you just won't take the final step for whatever reason. And you're a good man. You're a good man. So let me say that. Yeah, I suspect that this type of show appeals to all sorts of people. And if people give it a chance, it will do nothing but grow, because there's nothing more engaging than having a good chat, than having a chinwag, as I said. In terms of artistic magnificence, because that always is my point of departure, I don't know, I also find it, I suppose, in works of disbelief. What I learnt from my very brief explorations, brief in the sense that I think that they're lifelong, if one is really going to have an interest in Buddhism, Taoism, Zen, it can't just be cursory. It can't just be, it can't just be skimming over the surface. I mean, therefore, I'd say I have an acquaintance. I wouldn't say more than that. Some of the things that they have said, particularly maybe Islam, although I count that as genuine religion, what they say about the spirit, divinity, beauty, goodness, and truth has genuinely floored me by its profundity. And sometimes it's the unbeliever. We don't all have to be at each other's throats all the time. We don't always have to forget and abandon our basic humanity, and we can learn from each other. I don't feel threatened by the fact Richard Dawkins, who writes very good books. I mean, I read The God Delusion. It's beautifully written. It's just a shame I didn't agree with a single page. But it's beautifully written, Richard. I admit it, yes. And it struck me, I mean, when I read David Hume at university, I mean, if you want to read atheism, sorry, Richard, if you want to look at atheism, read David Hume, don't read Richard Dawkins. I mean, go to the horse's mouth. Don't worry about these later people. Because David Hume basically lays it on the line, and you know exactly what the problems are. So, and then you have to do whatever you do. Pray. That's what I say. Pray about it. Don't get into a tiz. Pray about it. Learn to love people more. Go out and give people some hugs. That's where you discover God. So for me, I mean, right, the magnificence of the beauty around us is mirrored. It is a reflection of the human heart. All beauty is in the human heart. When I went to Notre Dame many years ago, and thank heavens I did, because of course it recently burnt to the ground, I didn't find my Christianity under threat. I found it raised to an entirely new level. I was very aware that an alchemist, a genuine, actual, real one, which I'm sure you know a lot about, John, Falconelli, I mean, obviously a pseudonym, who wrote a book called The Mystery of the Cathedrals, explaining how, Notre Dame was actually an alchemical textbook, and people should look at the pictographs, they should look at the statues, they should look at the paintings if they wanted to understand how to perform the great work. What a mind-blowing thought. So I looked at all of them. I couldn't make head nor tail of many of them, but I had a good look at all of them. And so what was happening to me during that day? Yes, the great work was being performed. I was overwhelmed by the beauty that architects and working men had put together in a previous age. The staggering statuary, the beauty of the paintings, the glory of that wonderful building. And I don't know. Having another go at the Bible Belt. Sorry, Bible Belt. You know, I heard lots of things on social media. How wasn't it good that it was burning down? You know, it's a temple to occultism. You know, please go to France before you say ignorant things like that. It's something cultural. You know, but I was raised up on that day to see something even more beautiful in an unexpected way about the divine spirit. So what I can say in response is I think this show is a touchstone, an alchemical touchstone to all sorts of additional things. And you know, let's not limit our experiences. Either we're children of God or we're not. If we are, then let's not be afraid of words and opinions that don't always gel easily with our own. And let's look at the unbeliever, let's look at foreign cultures in order to be reminded most of the time about the genuine depth of our own. There's a war going on in the West at the moment about the entire legacy of Western culture. And yeah, it's not been perfect. Yeah, whoever said it was? Nobody's ever said Western people are perfect, Europeans are perfect, present company accepted, Americans are perfect. Nobody's ever said that. But you know, what you have in this part of the world is a belief which you don't necessarily have, say, in Central Asia, that things can get better. It's not just a question of kismet. It's not just a question of fate. It's not just a question of destiny. That actually a good bit of hard work, genuine conversations with people you don't always agree with, exploring new things like a glorious Gothic cathedral, which I think had so many secrets it was untrue, as a major work of art. All of this makes us more human, and the minute we become more human, we start touching our divine legacy. What do you think of that, John?
Well, yeah, Fulcanelli, The Mystery of the Cathedrals. It's one of my favorite books of all time. I'm of the opinion that it's actually the result of a group of people around Schwaller de Lubitz. And I have our Schwaller de Lubitz, the Temple of Man and the Temples of Karnak right behind me here, which are remarkable studies. He spent a great many years living in Luxor, studying the temples there and doing a similar study, comparing the Egyptian canon of proportion to the Vitruvian canon of proportion. You know, how many heads is the length of the human body and all that. He did a whole extensive study of that. Consequently, he's roundly ignored by the Egyptology community, although many of them have his works, but they just have them kind of secreted away. They don't really get into mentioning him, which is interesting. And believe me, I know, because like I said, I created a relational database of Egyptology and Mesopotamian studies in excess of, I don't know, 15,000 volumes or so. And he's not somebody that came up in conversations. So that gives you an interesting hint at the gap between material science, academia, and the mission in the esoteric mission in the West of theosophy and anthroposophy and Rosicrucianism, spiritual science, all these various modalities that are attempting to get at the marrow of the question, rather than just being a study and measure number and weight, but to actually get into the essence, what's implied. It's in the preface to The Mystery of the Cathedrals by Fulcanelli, is by Caslier. And in there, he makes the point about the green language, and that the green language is the Langvert. It's the language of the troubadours and the trouviers. It's that language of poetry, that language of metaphor and simile, going through some great representatives that has a sub rosa meaning, that there's a symbolical meaning concealed within the words themselves, and kind of the mission of a student of that tradition is to aspire to become a Christophorus, a bearer of Christ. And that it's that whole image of being a Christophorus rather than the alternatives, which is Lucifer and Ahriman, and that they're pushed aside, as Christ said, "Get thee behind me, Satan," when he didn't like what Peter was coming up with. And so consequently, they have their role, but you should never make the mistake of thinking that there's anything central about that role, even though it's their mission to make you think so. And one of their favorite ways of doing it is by putting you within a philosophical quandary to where you think you were at war with them, when actually Christ is not at war with Lucifer. He's not at war with Satan. But Lucifer and Satan are at war with each other, and Christ is above the fray, being the light that casts no shadow. And as he says, resist not evil. And so consequently, he's using Lucifer and Ahriman in essence. It's because of this struggle that we have the possibility of freedom. It's because we can err that we can have freedom. If we were incapable of making mistakes, there wouldn't be any freedom. I mean, even a child can think that one through. And so Steiner makes the point that the Ahrimanic crystallization process, that hardening process, as opposed to dissolving into Lucifer. In the East, they want us to dissolve, into the no self, right? They don't really have a concept of what is to be offered here in the West, the Christ impulse itself. I mean, they have precursors of that impulse, Vishvakarma. But nonetheless, it's this whole concept of being able to accomplish the task of the fourth world, to become a fulfilled human being that is the actual challenge. And that's the representation of the cathedrals, is that the aspirations, being able to take up the task that was offered to mankind in the story that's recounted in the Old Testament, because that's the beginning of the story. The Garden of Eden relates to in the Lemurian period, and the whole idea of the separation of the sexes and all that. As we condensed into materiality gradually over vast periods of time, coming finally into the Lemurian period, which is really that consolidation. And there you have the stories regarding the Nephilim, which I guess is one of your pet subjects, and Adam and Eve, and that whole struggle between that's portrayed between the offspring, right? Because you have Cain and Abel, and that whole death mystery that's portrayed there, because it's really having to do with the coming together into materiality. And it's materiality that brings about the reality of birth and death. because before we entered into materiality, there really was no birth and death. You know, it's something that came along with the program here. And so consequently, as one enters into understanding this mystery, you can see that the two branches of the Western tradition are portrayed through the line of Cain, that's the lodges, that's the Masonic stream, and then the line of Seth, the Abel, Cain and Abel. And so consequently, understanding the Mother Church in that light, that it's a way of looking deeper into the riddle, because you have the priesthood embodied within the line of the Abel representation, and then you have the craftsman, which is the line of Cain, and you have the legend upon which Freemasonry is based that ties into the reconciliation that was almost brought about through King Solomon and Hiram of Tyre, but Hiram Abiff ends up. It's not that Solomon had him whacked, but he didn't stop it from happening. And so the three ruffians end up slaying Hiram Abiff because Queen of Sheba, that Solomon was so fascinated with, she took a liking to Hiram Abiff, right? And so he became jealous of Hiram's capabilities. Because, see, Solomon could envision the idea of a temple, but he couldn't build one. He had to go to Hiram of Tyre and Hiram Abiff, and through them, the cedars of Lebanon and all the craftsmen that they were able to muster, be able to build the first temple based upon the heavenly proportions. So again, we're back to our geometry. And it was meant to house the Ark of the Covenant, which was based upon proportions that were given to the Israelites. So this whole sacred mystery of the relationship between form and substance. Form and substance. It's always form and substance. And so you have the form of the church as a sacerdotal or sacred mystery that creates an elevated context for the experience of the Eucharist, of the communion. And that's the whole image of the transubstantiation is the concept. And whatever one might think about that, it's a genuine magical operation. And I mean it only in the best sense of the word. That it enables you to give you something that's actual physical encounter with the divine. And of course, atheists really have a problem with that one, but that's their nature. You know, they don't dwell within the concepts that could lead them to that. But it's quite interesting because I've really never found any atheists that were capable of reading the works of Rudolf Steiner. And I don't know that Richard Dawkins had ever read any or not. And it's interesting because through his sense of decorum and his elevated skills at prose, is capable of being very seductive in his atheism. And I think that's the quibble there, you know. So you see that it's the artful dodger, as they call him, you know. It to me something that's self-evident to him for whatever reason. Again, I don't presume to know what's going on between those ears, but he's surely an extremely intelligent man who's hasn't been able to take the next step, as you say.
Well, I must admit, when I first met Richard, it was a bit like talking to Torquemada. You know, he's absolutely certain about everything. And oh my God, yeah, I I'm sure that's not healthy. Don't be certain about everything, please. I mean, I enjoyed his first book, excuse me, The Selfish Gene. I thought that was intriguing. I hated his book Unweaving the Rainbow, because that it just struck me as sort of blunt, like a blunt object hitting people over the head as opposed to trying to persuade anybody about anything. Oh no, I think he's a complex character. I think he's a complex character, and he would be the last person in the world, to my understanding, that would deny that there's great beauty in nature, that there's something magnificent in nature. It strikes me it's a shame he won't take the next step, like you, John. But who knows what mysteries we're surrounded by? I mean, partly it's all the fault of Foucault, I think. I posted something on Facebook earlier today, a cartoon done in the style of those sort of worried posters you got in the 50s and 60s, whereby a desperate mother is phoning up a hotline that her son is using knowledge in the plural. So should she be worried? And the phone operator, the Samaritan, the other end of the line, says, "Oh my," paraphrasing, "she appears to have been reading Foucault. Just talk about human nature and watch and look at what look at what he does. Observe his reactions." You know, with the greatest respect to Richard and Foucault, I mean, yes and no, yes and no. Either you've come up with these wonderfully new views of human life and thought, or you simply added to the great tradition that was underway anyway. I rather suspect the latter is more true. I rather suspect there's something else going on there. I mean, the Catholic Church a couple of years ago finally admitted that Charles Darwin had made a contribution to our understanding of nature. Well, I was tempted to say better late than never, because who would deny that? It's rather the fault of clerics, and it's rather the fault of church establishments that they never do their homework and they never look more deeply into the issues that are being raised and why certain things get up other people's nose. An organized religion, it gets up my, as a practitioner and pastor, it gets up my nose a lot of the time. But but it's life. It's just what happens. It's what you do. The only thing you said a minute ago that really disappointed me was not thinking Falconelli was an actual person. I remember reading somebody's book years back. They were saying it was, you know more about this than I do, John. It was actually Jean-Julien Champagne who was it was a pseudonym for this French surrealist, and then he did the great work, and then he turned into a woman, and I thought, so that's what the great work does then. It makes you trans. It transforms you into the opposite gender, and you end up very happy, after that. So, God, I don't know what to say to that. I hope it's true. I don't know. I did think of Freemasonry once myself. With no disrespect to any Freemasons at all, and some of my best friends, to crack the gag again, are Freemasons. It just never really floated my boat, as they say over here. I have visited the Grand Lodge building in Great Queen Street on a number of occasions when I used to teach EFL many years ago to keep body and soul together. I took, because I was delighted with classes of adult students, English students from across the world, and it was a delight. It was a delight meeting all of them. And so I used to show them they wanted to see unusual British things. So we always went to that building, and there's a huge pentagram. So as a frustrated instructor, the first thing I did was point to the pentagram. Oh, look, there's something scary on the ground. And then you can't lose because you've got their attention for the rest of the tour. And we went round the building, and yet they've got a wonderful library, an incredible esoteric library. They've got a wonderful museum. We went to the museum, and some of the guides are incredibly knowledgeable, because people forget I think Freemasonry, at least the sort of exoteric sort, started here. And, the building reflects that. I mean, you've got pictures of the various Georges, you've got the paintings, you've got the cloaking rooms, you've got their spectacular temple area, shrine area, with a glorious mosaic, with some of the great philosophers, some of the great geometricians. I mean, I confess the last time I was sat there, again, thinking, apparently they were Italian architects, there were Italian artists involved in the mosaic. And I was trying to work out who they were. I mean, I read certain names in their guidebooks, and I'm not going to even mention them because they didn't ring true to me, because it looked like a different style. And I was thinking, well, is it them, or were they doing something on contract, or so you end up in art criticism if you're not careful, as opposed to actually anything mysterious and enlightening. So I was sat there thinking that, and also about what was it, Howard Hinton, and Journey in Flatlands, and all that non-Euclidean geometry stuff, which I think is absolutely intriguing. That's the basis of H.G. Wells' Time Machine, of course. People forget that. The time traveler is experimenting with non-Euclidean geometry, and he feels that you can get out of a third dimensional time-space relationship and actually end up at different points in a fourth dimensional relationship. I mean, that's intriguing. So I was sat there thinking all these heretical thoughts in terms of Freemasonry, and realizing they'd never welcome me into their fold if I was thinking all of that stuff. Oh, you might like this, by the way. As I say, as an undergraduate, I went to King's College. My nickname was the Heretic, which I'm very, very proud of. I hope I lived up to that all the time I was there. Beauty and truth. Either we're looking at the same tradition flowering through human nature, or we're not. I think it's very important to put the so-called detractors and rebels in a much wider perspective, because then we discover a single continuous unfolding tradition. My trouble with Nietzsche, if I had a trouble, I mean, beautifully written material again. Oh my God, I'm an adult, I can disagree. It's as simple as that. Oh my God, Nietzsche, you're a wonderful person, I disagree. My God, I've said it twice, John. It's that simple. Isn't that amazing? I mean, Nietzsche's the drunk at the party. He's obviously very clever. He's obviously very well read, but hey, he's the drunk. So, so does that mean you write off everything he says? No, but it means you don't take it as a clean departure from everything that's been learnt before. I personally see the Foucaults of the world, the Nietzsches of the world, the Richard Dawkins of the world as contributors to an ever more complexifying Western tradition of mathematical aesthetic physics, which is genuinely transforming the world around us and honestly trying to lead the world into a better space. I'm really sorry that people can't see those treasures at the moment in Western culture, because they're clearly there, and we throw them away at our peril because other cultures have other treasures that don't necessarily want to focus on those series of lenses, on those series of opportunities. And I think, personally, the world is a much sadder place if we don't think those things. There's nothing wrong with a bit of criticism, and there's nothing wrong with a critic. But, the whole act of what the critic is saying needs to be put into a wider context. And then you're back with harmony, you're back with proportion, you're back with geometry, and you're back on the way to beauty. That's what this incurable old optimist has to say. I don't know what you think about that, John.
You caught me on another screen. Yeah, I think that for those of you that are listening, he calls Foucault. Here in the U.S., we call him Michel Foucault. Just like Detroit is no longer Detroit. so that we have our own way of Anglizing, turning into English French names. But Foucault's Pendulum was quite a popular book here in the States. Yeah, it's interesting heritage, and you know, I like looking at those things to see what's the rub, you know, what's your problem, you know, and the problem is that I think they consider spiritual culture to be subjective, and as a result, when you look at what they're doing, and you see that, well, if it isn't meeting certain criteria that they're comfortable working in with their particular mathematical model of the universe, then it's out the window if they can't fit it into their formula. And okay, that's fine. You can do that. But it's that whole idea of abstraction and expecting life to conform to the rules of the mineral kingdom. And but Rudolf Steiner is very clear. We're not just mineral objects, you know. And if you try to extrapolate from the laws of the mineral kingdom and try to understand the vegetable, animal, and human realms just coming out of the mineral kingdom, you can only get so far. And that it's this whole idea of abstract thinking that it renders that inaccessible, that creates a barrier. As far as Nietzsche, Rudolf Steiner, I mean, one of his early works, Friedrich Nietzsche, Fighter for Freedom, it was published in English. And he was interesting because Rudolf Steiner was approached after Rudolf Steiner was the editor of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's scientific works during his time in his younger years, and it brought him into contact with a lot of the leading Goethe scholars of the time, including one of his teachers was Schroer, who was so important in coming to terms with Faust, the great literary work of Goethe. But Rudolf Steiner was tasked with editing Goethe's scientific works, and after he had done that, he was approached by Elsbeth Forster Nietzsche, Nietzsche's sister, to edit Nietzsche's works, and he declined. He said he would only do it on the condition that he could make margin notes on what sections were written when Nietzsche was healthy and what sections were written when he was ill, because as he became ill, it's believed that he had contracted perhaps syphilis, and so there was this degeneration going on. But ultimately, what happened was his proposal was not accepted, but he ended up writing the book on Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, Fighter for Freedom. And in the revisionist realm, it's now known that Elsbeth Forster Nietzsche edited Nietzsche's works herself and inserted her own content. So a lot of the negative things that have come, that people tend to pin on Nietzsche is actually from his sister, who was a great fan of the National Socialist crowd. And so consequently, once again, we have this. But I think that the real beginning, the real genesis of this type of thought is in Nietzsche's work that's published in English as The Birth of Tragedy. And if you're getting into understanding theater and literature and all that I would recommend that work to anybody. I mean, talk about brilliant. I mean, geez, to come to terms with the tradition of the West itself and to give the underpinnings of the fruition of literary culture, theater, and all of that. It's absolutely breathtaking in its scope. And so Nietzsche, and he had a heck of a mustache to boot. But yeah, getting into some of those people, I don't know. If you get into the existentialists, I like some of the more artistic works more than their ponderings. You know, like Sisyphus, the myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. That's an interesting one because he makes the point. Sisyphus is the whole idea is that Sisyphus has to take this rock up the hill, right? And then once it gets to the top, it rolls back down and he runs back down. And then he takes up his task and it just happens over and over and over. And Camus makes the interesting point that the only time when Sisyphus is not suffering is when he's pushing the rock because he's too busy. And that on the way down, as he's walking down to take up his task, that's when he realizes, oh, this is a drag. But while he's pushing the rock, he's too busy pushing the rock to think about his suffering. And I think that's an interesting contribution from the existential community. It's interesting. The French, they tend to be really embodiments of the intellectual soul that was really in its heyday during the period preceding our modern age of the spiritual soul or the consciousness soul, as Rudolf Steiner described it, the age that began around 1413, 1414 AD. And so for the previous age before that, it's really the intellectual soul, which is fully embodied in the works of St. Thomas Aquinas and the Summa Theologium, you know, and so that's a real interesting carrying forward of the Aristotelian thought, but going on and on, dropping names just like rocks, but I don't know, the existential thing. It's interesting how that feeds into this postmodernism, and it's finally reached its nub in the neo-Marxists of the Frankfurt School. That really, I see them to a large extent an outgrowth of that whole existential dilemma, and you have this dialectical materialism of the Soviet system that just self-destructed. I mean, if your ideas don't embrace truth, they will crumble. It's a question of how they'll stick around, well, but how long before they're turned into compost, because any seeds that don't take root and grow, they become compost for life as we know it. And that's the real lesson. That's the point that Rudolf Steiner tried to make. You say, look, you know, you throw out these seeds, they're not all going to grow, but they are a part of the whole process itself, that there's something that contributes to the overall nurturing of nature that takes place. And so it is within the realm of thought. You know, you could plant an idea, like I coined a phrase many, many years ago, truth serves its own ends. All else serves as compost, nurturing its growth. And so that's what we're looking at. And it's okay to entertain all these different ideas, because the judgment on you, we'll see how that works out, you know. Okay, go ahead, see how that works out for you. And ultimately, because in light of the esoteric concept of the world, it's allowing a place for the supersensible to participate in your world, even if it's only on Sundays, taking part in the sacrament or saying your prayers in the morning, that you want to have a sacred space that's a part of your life, even if it's just a private sacred space. Although, keep in mind, as I'm frequently reminded by Barbara, is that if you're embarrassed of him, he's embarrassed of you. or ashamed rather. If you're ashamed of him, he's ashamed of you. And so consequently, you have these reality of these spiritual beings that are patiently awaiting, are awakening, and that our capacities of being able to perceive the supersensible is dependent on our willingness to strive. And it's through the striving toward the supersensible that we develop the supersensible organs of perception that are outlined in a book we published years ago. A reprint is The Way of Initiation, and Initiation and Its Results. It was very early translations by Max Giese and Clifford Bax of the early versions of Knowledge of Higher Worlds by Rudolf Steiner. It's interesting because the editions that we published were printed by McCoy Masonic Supply Company. And so that was one of the earliest publishing houses for Rudolf Steiner's works in America was through a Masonic publishing supply company. And I think that's very interesting, in that the whole concept of initiation, because Masonry has to do with it's a symbolical initiation, but yet in the way of initiation and in initiation and its results, Rudolf Steiner is giving you the actual guidelines for initiation. And those are the topics that I struggle with in my works, the Arcana of the Grail Angel and the Arcana of Light on the Path. And so you have to be able to create a context for the miracle to take place, really. Because it's, as Goethe said, the eye was created by light to receive light.
I think I'm getting worse at turning off my mute button. Oh gosh, language. Yeah, I suppose I'm a Francophile. I hate to admit that. I think British people hate to admit that, but I think I'm a Francophile. You know, so Foucault would be the common way I'm used to saying that, and Sartre, which of course is only ever said in Paris, as opposed to Sartre. But I've been told off by various people at Cambridge. No, go to Paris. Listen to the way they say it. For me, the culmination, the final flowering of existentialism is found in personalism. I think existentialism can flow into a number of reservoirs, and it can flow into that sort of later Sartrean materialist communist, although he said he was. I mean, Ionesco slapped down Jean-Paul Sartre in a famous interview. You know, you get the charming young French journalist, oh, Mr. Ionesco, what do you think of Jean-Paul Sartre? To which he replies, oh no, Sartre. 1 minute he says he loves the Germans until they lose the war. Now he's a communist, you know. So you know, I think we've got to bear in mind that oh my God, that you seem to be bilocating, John. That proves maybe your sainthood.
It was something you said.
Maybe it was something. Well, I'm sure you're closer to sainthood than I am. I'm just a short, fat person who enjoys a very good French meal. So if any French restaurants are listening, invite me. Yeah, I mean, you know, so it can end up in those sort of dry wastelands, I suspect, but it can also end up in the ever fertile fields of personalism. Of course, Pope John Paul II was a personalist. I thought he handled those thoughts very, very well. And that, of course, is a unique insight into the psychosensual, psychophysical human condition, which we can talk about at some other point, because I actually do think that needs airing. And it's the personalists who say, well, look, you know, there are two ways of looking at Western knowledge and the way the Western enterprise is trying to express itself. Either you end up with a denuded, rather shallow, but very accurate description of facts and names and dates. And okay, that is accurate, but somehow there's a lot missing. Somehow there are huge swathes of human descriptions missing, if that's all you want to get to. And for me, that's sadly where Richard Dawkins and sadly the Cambridge atheists end up. So you end up with something accurate but shallow, or you get a more messy way of looking at life, and it's not as accurate, but it's richer and it's more deep. It's deeper, it's more sophisticated, it's more fulfilling. And of course, it's actually truer to the human organism by description. And, you know, so you either end up with this sort of shallow, materialistic, scientific description. I mean, the academy itself, sadly, is no longer the academy. Now it seems to be something like a rival church with its own doctrines and its own dogma. That's a very great shame, because the whole point of the academy was to look for the good, the beautiful, and the true, and not presume what it was ahead of time. So that's a very great shame. Let's hope it gets out of this slough of despond very quickly, or you end up with a more messy, aesthetic description of life, which is richer and fuller and somehow more human. And I think that's where personalism comes to its own, and that's where existentialism as the first step towards that is really invaluable. I don't know what you think about that, John. And yes, I'm sorry to come out as a Francophile. You know, it was being frightened by cheese and bread at an early age. What can I say? There used to be a French onion salesman where I grew up in Hampshire. Obviously, he's had a very traumatic effect on me. I love the culture to bits, even though they never bloody answer you in English. If you go to France and you say something in French, they always bloody answer you in English. So I'm sorry, that is rude, monsieur. Right? So anyway, what do you think of all that, John?
Or contrary, if you ask them a question in English, they may just pretend like they don't know what you're saying, even though you'll see them 5 minutes later talking to somebody in English. So, and Paris considers themselves above everybody else in France. You know, well, the British have this thing too, though. They come on. I mean, they'll make up the British way of saying just about anything. You know, it's like we finally Sri Lanka after a very, very long period of time is Ceylon. And so consequently, the British, they always have their own name for things, and also incomprehensible way of pronouncing their own words. I mean, let's see, pronounce, you got to click on your mute so you could do this for me. Pronounce Worcestershire in British.
Worcester.
So what's with all the letters? Tell me. What?
Oh, Webster is to blame for all of this. Webster and the War of Independence. I blame Webster. Oh gosh, no. I mean, I don't think the British are as bad as the French, actually. You know, I come from the sort of European-loving Noel Coward, Gertrude Lawrence sort of Britishness that was actually really pro-Europe. You know, I don't come from that sort of empire-building, you know, terrific force that went around the world and upset everybody. No, I think there's a certain attitude that the British wanted everything to be British, whereas the French wanted everything to be revolutionary republic. And, you know, you would do that whether you wanted to or not. So there was a sort of imperialism inbuilt into French culture that you don't actually get in Britain. You know, it's all about being a gentleman and making loads of money, as opposed to actually doing anything cultural. I mean, that would be very far away from most British people. No, but that's why I love the French so much. I think the poison of this country, to my mind, has been the class system for hundreds of years. Whereby, I mean, it isn't Rome. We're not Roman. You know,
Yeah,
so
okay. But where did they get that? They got it from the French. Right.
Right. Hands up. Hands up. Yeah, they got it from the French. We got it from the French.
Yeah.
You know, there are certain bits.
If you go back, you see that the court language of Europe was what? French. And even in Russia, the Tsar would speak French. He would only speak Russian to his servants and his dog, right? And so they could speak freely because the serfs didn't know French, right? And so it became like this kind of private language of the upper classes. And of course, that has to do largely with the Norman French impulse, more so than just the purely French. But a Frenchman would probably tell you otherwise. But it's interesting. It's an interesting inheritance. Well, we're getting near the end of our little nuanced conversation here, and I can't tell you how much I'm enjoying all of this, and it doesn't even matter how many people are enjoying it with us. Again, to go back, don't forget David's books are available on Amazon. Not my favorite company. And my books are available on eBay. And I happen to have seen a copy of my second book available for $2,000. So I don't know what kind of donation they're expecting on that. I thought that was a little, that's twice the highest I'd seen before was 1,000. Now it's 2,000. So I think they're counting on some librarian at a university with a large budget that has a request for a book, and they'll just order it and not even care because it's not their money anyways. But you don't have to buy it from them. You can buy them from me on eBay, the Arcana of the Grail Angel, or Arcana of Light on the Path. And also, any of you want to buy a cup of coffee for me or for Reverend David, of course, you can avail yourself of PayPal. And I'm trying to bring up the details, except I can't spell. Here it is. And no, I can't find the file now. That's okay. In any event, I can let David do that, but mine is PayPal.me/John Barnwell 888, and David has PayPal that you could donate, which is PayPal.me/DPARRY777, I believe is the handle on that one. And I've appreciated very much, Lee, the cups of coffee and whatnot that people have bought me in the books. I had the opportunity of sending one off to Israel just the other day. Oh, one of the people says, she's selling hers for $1,000. Well, read it first, Cynthia. In any event, so there's no end to this story, so we'll continue on, and this is the 8th episode, and soon to follow will be the 9th episode. And so if you could you please lead us in a closing prayer in the name of Christ?
Just to say, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, Twitter, and I've got my own website. I'm also available for corporate dues and bar mitzvahs. Anyone that wants to give me a booking, I'm a poor pastor, and I'm open to offers. Oh, John, we've had another wonderful show. The light of Christ has been with us, and therefore all I can say is, my dear friends, may the warmth of the heart and the brilliance of each of our minds enlighten our paths in the days ahead. May we remain faithful in our calling to be better human beings and true to the powers of love and wisdom in the whole of our bodies and souls, because they are God and from God. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.